mostly
This
fighting
conference
fires.
will now be recorded.
When I was a lot younger, I fought fires and then went on to school and did a degree in forestry and then a master's in fire science. I've been consulting largely in fire since I graduated from university in '88. My specialty has been focused around community protection, risk assessment, and I had the fortunate opportunity after the first big fire season we had in 2003 to work for Gary Filman and helped author or contributed to the authorship of his fuel management recommendations. And one of those recommendations was to promote and adopt FireSmart, which has been a work in progress in British Columbia for the last, 15, 16 years. So tonight I want to talk to you about the focus here is protecting your own property from a wildfire or from a forest fire ignition. I don't know how many of you followed. Just 2 weeks ago, there was a significant fire in Squamish. Very unusual. I can't honestly say when I recall a fire on the coast this early, but it's been exceptionally dry in April. Record dry period continues into May. And even though we're not used to talking about fire on the coast, we seem to be, over the last 5 to 6 years, seeing significant periods of drought, which do make our coastal forests vulnerable to fire. And so that makes paying attention to this kind of information even more important. So I think if you look back over the last 20 years, we've had roughly about, well, there's two missing here, 2010 and 2014 were also big fire years, but we've had about 7 significant wildfire seasons since 2003 and including 2003. We've had economic, social, and environmental damage during those fires. And we've had significant financial losses that emphasize a greater consideration with respect to fires in communities. I'm sure many of you heard or have heard of the fires in Fort McMurray, fires in Alberta and at large, California, Washington State, and Oregon. We seem to be in a real regional period of fire activity. Just this week, the fire forecast for the Pacific Northwest came out, and in Canada, we're showing well above abnormal drought, both temperature and precipitation, right across through Manitoba into the Northwest Territories and the Yukon. So it doesn't seem to want to go away. So we're going to talk tonight about communities that are defined as interface, where if you look here, interface is where the community meets the edge of the forest, and intermixed, where we have islands of development buried within the forest. And Anmore has both of these. I should have said that I did do the first community wildfire plan for the village of Anmore back as part of a regional plan that I did for Metro Vancouver in 2007. The plans have been dated now and things have changed, but nonetheless, I am familiar with some of the interface in Anmore. So we've got these two classes of interface, and we're also very concerned about spotting, and spotting I'll describe a little bit later, but that is when we get a forest fire and we get a smoke column, depending on how hot that fire is, what fuel types burn, we have embers that move up into the smoke column that are burning. These travel different distances depending on the wind and the fuel type. They land on something that's potentially vulnerable and they start new fires. If your home has vulnerable surfaces or your vegetation is vulnerable to those spots, you will get ignition. So the whole focus in talking about FireSmart is to reduce the ignitions around the home, or what we call the ignition zone. And we'll talk about that more as we go through tonight's presentation. And as Karen said, please ask questions. I know everybody has specific things on their property that they're interested to hear about, but I'm going to try and give you a real solid background on what to think about and what you can do about some of these things. So we've got interface, that's where the forest meets the edge of the community, and intermix, that's the islands of homes within the community. We have two kinds of threats here, particularly on the coast. We have the potential for a wildland fire, something that was started by lightning up the hill, moving into the community. But probably on the coast here, our bigger risk is something like a human-caused fire, a house fire, spreading to the vegetation and then into the broader forest. So I actually tend to think that that is our bigger risk here on the coast, where so many people have so much vegetation in and around the home or immediately adjacent to the house. That vegetation can start on fire from a house fire or from, you know, intermittent types of risk barbecues, lawnmowers, etc., are capable of starting a fire on an individual property. We're really focused on quantifying risk. What's the probability and what's the consequence if we have a fire? And the thing about the Lower Mainland is, compared to the interior, the probability has historically been on the low to moderate side. In recent years, I see that the probability is shifting to a moderate high, particularly in the July-August period. When I started in this business, we really thought about coastal fire activity sort of the middle of July to early August, and then by then the relative humidities were coming back up in the evening. We're getting heavier dews. But over the last 10 years, 15 years, we've seen that the periodicity of high fire danger is lasting anywhere from 50 to 60 days through the fire season, whereas historically it really was only about 30 days. The other thing about the Metro Vancouver area is we have very high property values, very significant buildup of homes. And so the consequence of fire here in Metro Vancouver is very significant. And in Anmore, you have some beautiful homes, well-constructed, significant investments in property development. And so we really want to focus on dealing with these risks associated with fire. So historically, I would have said, you know, we had low probability, high consequence. It still meant active intervention. It meant educating people, trying to communicate to people some of the risk profiles and some they could do. But now, as I said, I think we're moving more into the moderate high category, where we really need to step up what we're doing about mitigating this risk. And I think that's probably the most important consideration. If there's one thing that I communicate to you tonight, is that the risk is growing, and I think that you as the individual property owner has the most influence on protecting your home and your property. So these are some more rural properties, but they give you an idea of people who have built in the forest and really have too much vegetation in and around the home. They also have hazards like this particular photo with the big wood pile right on the porch. The porch is open underneath. That's a home that, if that wood pile were to go, that home would be likely gone, because the heat from that would be very difficult to control. The other thing to be thinking about in an interface fire is your structural fire department is a volunteer department. They probably really only have the capacity to deal with 1 or 2 house fires. And what happens in these larger interface events is we get multiple ignitions of multiple homes, and it typically overwhelms the structural fire resource, and air tankers and other things aren't capable of dealing with house fires at that scale. So we may have 1 fire or 2 fires, but really what we're trying to protect against is multiple homes catching on fire in one of these events. Here in the left-hand lower corner, you can see a house that's got 2 propane bottles. Propane is hazardous around the home, so big propane tanks are a concern. And so is some of the minor vegetation around the home, particularly the trees overhanging the house. And when I talk about fire leaving the property and moving into the broader forest, these homes all would have the capability of heating the fuel up in the trees next to them and moving fire off the property. So here's again some examples where the edge meets the building on the left, and the whole the home is ignited there through spots. You can see this material in the photo on the left that you can see remnants of leaves and branches. Those were actually materials collected after the Okanagan Mountain Park fire that spotted into people's backyards. They were burning landed on people's backyards. That's the type of material. It caught vulnerable materials, whether it's wood roofing, vegetation in the yard on fire, and started the home on fire. So that's the what we call the spotting risk. And here's that edge effect where you've got radiant heat from the edge of the forest, gets so hot that it ignites a home that's right next to that edge. So we want to make sure, the other thing too is if we've got structures that are close together, and by close I would say within 30 feet, we get structure to structure contact. So we've got both the raining embers coming down and the potential for structure to structure contact where the homes are in close proximity. Or there's buildings, outbuildings on the property, whether it's sheds or a carriage house or something that's too close to the main house. There isn't separation. If one structure is on fire, then it has the potential to start the second structure on fire. So this is another graphic that depicts the spotting that we've talked about. So here you can see on the left-hand side, the forest is on fire. There's a smoke column. It's carrying those embers aloft. Depending on how hot that fire is, what kind of fuels, they can go miles up into the smoke column, and then they're transported by wind and drop into other parts of the forest or into the community. And the orange circles represent embers that are still burning. The white circles you can see represent embers that aren't burning. So there's a distance that they will travel depending on wind, depending on fuel type. If you look at, say, for instance, Australia, they've measured spotting that's 25 kilometers in distance. Here in BC, it's rare for our fuel types to spot more than 3 kilometers. We've had measured spotting of 9 kilometers. We typically manage communities within a 2 kilometer spotting distance. That's usually the number that we, so this gives you the intent of this graphic is to, just because your property isn't on fire doesn't mean those embers can't rain down and drop burning material onto the property. And that's what we want to really focus on tonight in terms of making your property less vulnerable to fire. So I'm going to just show a short video here which really emphasizes this. And let me, sorry, I'll just minimize this. And this, let's see, how am I going to do this? Okay, and here comes our video. And this is put on by the Disaster Safety Organization. It's an institute, part of the Insurance Institute of America. And they're going to show you a home with different materials, different building and structure, and how an ember shower impacts that home. So this structure is designed to demonstrate a typical home. Here you can see in the front, there's wood roofing in the form of shakes. You've got Duraid roofing, you've got hardy board, vinyl siding, aluminum gutters, vinyl gutters. And here they're putting material that they're gonna put into an array of fans that's gonna be burning that will simulate that ember shower. So plants, landscaping material, and mulch are all placed around the home, which is very similar to what many of us have in our home. And you're gonna see that this material will actually contribute to the fire moving onto the structure. So they use what are ember generators, and they have 3 stacks of fans that deliver the equivalent of about a 25 kilometer wind and embers. And you can see the embers floating onto the structure there. The idea is that you can get an idea of what fire does. And if you think about the California fires, any of the interface fires, Fort McMurray, they all had these phenomena, and these were responsible for significant losses. So you're going to see the mulch in the garden is going to catch fire, and you see the wood, the gutter is catching fire, and then you're going to see the wood roof catch on fire. So lots of things start to happen very quickly to this home. But you're going to see where proper materials have been used that the fire doesn't ignite the house. So again, you see all the landscaping here. You can see the vinyl gutters are melting. The aluminum gutters are holding up on the left. You're going to see the hardy plank on the left of the building is not going to burn. That's the siding, but the vinyl siding is going to melt and then eventually create an ignition. And the material, it's the vegetation material, leaf material, from the trees, you can see it burning on the roof. That contributes to the fire. And largely, much of the garden mulch and plants that were next to the home are now all engaged in fire. And here you're going to see the shake roof go up. And you can see in the corner that where the fire hits the wood lap, the wall burns, whereas the other wall, which is built of hardy board, which is a cement wood composite, fire resistant, doesn't burn. So you can see how some of these building materials have a really significant influence on how the home is impacted. And you can see the hardy plank on the left didn't burn. It's fiber cement, wood, cement composite. And it's a common building material that's being used today. The vinyl siding, you can see in the front is melting on the right. And the next thing you're going to see is that this is single pane glass, and the fire is going to basically blow through the window and move into the living area of the home. The other thing is that if you don't have proper screening in your attic, and when I say proper screening, that's 3mm screening, the embers move right into the attic or through the soffits, and again start the house on fire. Here you have that window screen and the embers penetrating through that, and you'll see that the flames penetrate the window. And if you've got living furniture, drapes, other things here, that's going to start the interior of the house on fire. So this just gives you a really good sample of when we're talking about an ember shower, an interface fire, the kind of thing that we're really concerned about. So I'll turn that off and we'll go back to our presentation here, which will be, bear with me for a minute, from the current slide. Okay, that's not what I meant to do, so I gotta change that back. Sorry folks, I'm having technical difficulties with my screen sharing tonight because you don't want to see my slide. Yeah, let's see if I can. Sorry, I apologize for this. Sorry, I wasn't expecting this. Okay, so that, we want to go there. We want to go there. And let's see. Okay, I'm going to do this a different way. Okay, we'll do it this way. So we've gone through the video. So there are a lot of suppression resources that are activated when there is a fire. But ideally, if your home is cluttered with materials, there's a lot of vegetation, and access is problematic in terms of getting on your property, those resources are going to be hard pressed to actually action the fire. The other thing too is if you've got a lot of overhead vegetation on your property, the effectiveness of retardant and the ability of people to get onto your property is going to be difficult. So all of the principles that we're talking about here are about making your property more accessible in terms of that activity on the property of putting out the fire. So really what we're talking about here is the objective is to help the overall community resources in wildland urban interface mitigation to reduce the risk. That's the objective of FireSmart. And it's to assist in being better adapted to wildfires and more resilient when they occur. And we call this program FireSmart. So many of you have heard about FireSmart, but really what we're trying to do is make the buildup area less vulnerable to both the ember shower, and if there is a fire to occur on the property, that it's not easily going to spread into the wildland. And I can't make that point more stringently. So there's two main avenues, and you saw them in the video, in terms of how you can manage your home to be fire smart. One is you change the vegetation type and the density of vegetation and the setback from the building. Ideally, the recommendations of FireSmart is that you don't have any flammable vegetation within 10 meters of the building. That means trees, hedging, or shrubs that will burn. And if you can, and I recognize that much of your community is built out, but certainly when you're constructing new buildings, you want to change the structure to reduce the vulnerability. Or in the simplest case, if you have a wood roof right now and you have to re-roof, don't re-roof it with wood roofing. Re-roof it with a Class A Duroid. Even rubber roofing is better than wood roofing. So that's the simplest thing. Don't replace a wood roof when you're in a vulnerable area that can be exposed to an ember shower with something that can burn. So we talked about three zones around a house. Most people really only control the 10-meter zone. If you're on a rural property, you might control the 10 to 30-meter zone. But really, what we're going to talk about tonight is focusing on that area right around your home, that 30-foot zone. Because if you have a rated roof, if you address the vegetation immediately around your home, you have a very high probability of surviving an interface event, somewhere around 85% if the roofing is protected. So we're really focused on mitigating the probability of a fire moving from the forest to the building or home, or spreading from the building or the home to the forest. If you want to go to the manuals and find details about this, there are FireSmart manuals at www.firesmartcanada.com, or you can go to the BC Wildfire Service, BCWS FireSmart, and they also have a BC manual that will highlight a lot of the same things that I'm talking about tonight. So again, we've got that priority zone around the house. After the Fort McMurray fire, the priority zone was expanded to create a 1A priority zone along with a 1. And the 1A, which you saw in that video, was the immediate vegetation next to the house. So you saw that there was shrubs, mulch that could catch on fire that was immediately adjacent to the house. That's even more important when we talk about decking and fire that can spread under an open deck, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So here's Fort McMurray, an example. Fire came out of the background here into the community, and you can see that it randomly, I'll say randomly, took out a lot of homes. These homes here, down on the bottom of the slide, largely were structure-to-structure contact. So some of these had vegetation that caught on fire, and they caused structure-to-structure contact. If you look at the homes that didn't burn, there's a little bit of space between some of them, but they also had they don't have any vulnerable vegetation or very little vegetation that would have burned on the property. So they don't really meet that 10-meter zone, but you can see how impactful the vegetation is in terms of starting the fire and spreading a fire. And in fact, this home, there's one home here, this gray home that's intact, was actually very close to the forest edge. But because it had the 10-meter separation, because it didn't have a lot of vulnerable vegetation, and because it was built from the right materials, they didn't catch on fire. Fire obviously is random, and sometimes you get a bit lucky, but this kind of highlights some of the things that we've been talking about so far this evening. So one of the challenging things to implementing Fire Smart that we see all the time is people generally don't feel they're at risk. So number one, you need to understand, be aware of the risk. Lack of engagement is another one. I can tell you that I would have done these Fire Smart seminars 15 years ago. Even after the Kelowna Mountain Park fire, I did a seminar about this time the year after. I had 2 people come to one of these workshops. I can tell you that I've been doing them on Bowen Island the last 2 summers. I did 3 last year and 3 the year before, and I'm getting between 40 and 60 people come to each workshop. So people are starting to understand the risk of this issue is growing, and the engagement is going up. People don't, sorry, my mouse is very sensitive here. People are concerned about the cost of this. And removing trees or removing vegetation isn't cheap. We're going to talk about some of the principles of that. Also, there's the disposal issue. How do you get rid of this material if you can't burn it, or if you have to remove it and haul it off your property? The perceived actions to some people seem onerous to be Fire Smart. Obviously, people have construction materials of an existing building that may not meet the Fire Smart, and sometimes it may just be lack of funding. So those are important considerations. So here's that, we're back to that priority zone 1. I talked about it earlier. It's really important to be thinking about that 10-meter free zone around the home to ensure that you don't get direct flame contact with the building. You want to reduce the potential for radiant heat. And the reason we use 10 meters is essentially heat from the forest dissipates over that 30 meters such that it can't cause combustible material to burn on the side of the home, on the roof, or on other parts of the home. And I'm going to show you some examples. It becomes one of the most important things here on the coast is we use a lot of juniper, cedar, and flammable bush and hedges to screen our homes for privacy and or just for general landscaping. I can tell you that in dry conditions, these materials are very flammable and will spread fire onto your house or through your property, and they're a conduit for fire moving through. So again, in this priority zone, you want to change the structure to reduce the vulnerability of fire. You want to focus on the roof first, building exterior and siding materials. Another big one is open decks. You can see that in this home, there's an open deck, and embers get underneath those decks, move in underneath, and start the deck on fire underneath. So ideally, you want to sheath in both decking or openings on porches and things, so embers don't get under there and start a fire in a crack or crevice in some of those. The other big thing, and it's particularly important for firefighters, is combustible materials. You don't want to store things like gasoline, ammunition, propane within close proximity to your home. Generally, again, the focus, particularly if you're on a forested lot, you want to have those combustible materials 10 meters away from the home, because if your home catches on fire or there is an event, that puts firefighters at risk. These propane tanks, the bigger ones particularly, are explosive during these wildfire events. And typically, what we recommend is that you run a small copper pipe from the home out to the propane tank 10 meters away from the building. And you certainly don't want to store them in your garage or in an open area like a deck area. Same thing with wood piles. You don't want the wood pile immediately adjacent to your home because it's a source of ignition if an ember lands on it. So these are examples of better construction. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that everybody rebuilds their home, but here you can see the hardy plank. You can see a duroid roof. Duroid's a lot cheaper than wood. Proper screening so the embers can't get in. Stucco, cement siding, all of these kinds of materials are the kind we should focus on. Cedar decking is not the best. It won't easily ignite, but if the structure gets on fire, cedar will burn quite badly. So we want to focus on non-combustible materials. If you're doing a renovation to your home or doing an add-on, these are important considerations when you do that renovation. If you must put shake or wood siding on, or you already have it on your structure, you can buy retardant that can be painted on, fills the pores of the wood with a resinous material that will reduce their flammability and combustibility for a period of time. Expensive, generally speaking, about $100 a gallon for this material. If we typically write a lot of wildfire mitigation plans for builders who are building new homes. We recommend that they have less than 20% decorative wood on the exterior of the home if possible, and that if they go over that threshold, we recommend that they treat it with these materials. If you already have wood, you don't have an alternative, certainly the face to the forest, if you could treat that, that's a step closer to making an improvement over having just untreated wood exposed to embers, as we've talked about before. Here's a good example of what happens to cedar hedging. This is one of the California wildfires, and this hedging material was ignited by embers from the fire. You can only imagine if this cedar or juniper or other flammable type of vegetation is immediately adjacent to your home, you're going to have a big problem. And it's going to be difficult for structural firefighters to get to your home safely and put that fire out, particularly if these are 5 to 6 meters tall. Some hedging on the coast here gets very large, lots of biomass, and once it starts on fire, is extremely difficult and very unsafe for firefighters to extinguish. So we need to focus on landscaping and the things that we can do. Here's an example where this home on the bottom has got good defensible space. It's got a patio that's not going to ignite with embers. It's got a good grass lawn, and pretty much all of the vegetation is succulent. A really good example of a flower garden that has absolutely no flammable material. This individual thought they were building a really fire smart home, but you can see that the deck is exposed. It's all a wood structure. They had a suitable roofing, but they left trees overhanging. That home probably wouldn't survive an interface fire just because of its construction, and there's too much vegetation immediately close to it. Even though this individual did a great job graveling around the home, and so the gravel wouldn't have been vulnerable to those embers, there's still a lot of area where we've got an ignition zone. They did a good job of pruning up the limbs, so fire isn't going to easily move up the trunk of the tree into the crowns, and then the crowns spreading. But if that ember shower came, it's likely to start the crowns on fire. It's likely to start fire under the decking, on the wood siding, and so this home probably wouldn't survive. Here's examples of some of that flammable material. We've got yew down here. We've got western red cedar hedging, and we've got juniper. All of these things, when they dry out, have a high component of extractives. That's resinous and chemicals that are extremely flammable when these dry. I have seen, even during Halloween, if you were to light the interior of some of these types of hedges, which stay dry even after extensive rain, they will burn extensively and will threaten a home. You can see the size of some of this hedging. It's exceptionally large. We recommend against having any of this immediately adjacent to the home and ideally surrounding the home, because they're just a conduit for fire to move through your property. Can you have some smaller ones further away from the house that aren't contiguous, that aren't tall? Yes, of course. But just look back to this photo that I showed you earlier about how these were well separated, and you're going to have contact to contact between these, even though they're distanced about a meter and a half, there's still contact to contact in this hedgerow. So again, it's an important thing to recognize. You have the option of trying to create some mitigative opportunities. Pardon me, I'm just having a drink of water. Some people, if they are embedded right in the forest, have bought relatively cheap sprinkler systems. You can generally, there's some places on the Lower Mainland, I can get you names if you're interested, where you can put a rooftop sprinkler up. You can have a rainwater cistern next to your house that can hold anywhere from 600 to 1,000 liters. There's vinyl cisterns that you can purchase that fill up with rainwater. You can, if you have a fire in close proximity, your sprinklers on the roof during that high fire danger period, and you can just turn on the sprinkler with ideally a small something like a Honda pump that runs on a big reservoir of gas or on electricity, but the electricity is vulnerable because you may lose your electricity. It's better to use a gas pump. But if you sprinkle your home for several hours before the fire gets there, you can only imagine that wetting down this area, when those embers land, they're extinguished by that wet surface. So ideally, if you can sprinkle your roof, you have a much higher probability of mitigating the potential for that ember shower to impact your property. And the more you wet down that 10-meter zone, the higher the probability that fire is going to affect your property. The province, since 2003, has deployed in some of the large interface events sprinkler protection units, and they've been seen to be extremely valuable in protecting vulnerable homes. But if you want to take the step, or you live in a real heavily forested lot, I would recommend that you consider some form of sprinkler system. Generally cheap. You can generally install something for between $800 to $1,500 when we're talking about what you're trying to protect. The other consideration is if you're on an individual well, or you're not on municipal water, if you're on an electric pump system, relying on that for water may not be the best option. So that's why I'm suggesting you may have an independent cistern or something where you're not depending on electricity to pump that water. Because often, particularly in a community like Anmore, where the distribution of power is largely by wood poles, we may lose power if some of those wood poles burn. In that Squamish fire 2.5 weeks ago, they lost about 30 wood poles in that fire, mostly from grass at the base of the poles, starting the poles on fire. Very common for BC Hydro to lose infrastructure during some of these wildfire events, which means we lose power. Again, I'm not sitting here saying recommending every tree on your property be removed. Certainly you can do things. These trees were pruned up on the right, and this tree that was overtopping this roof was lifted off the roof. In fact, there was branches right onto the deck, and this property owner was asked to prune his tree. He got his branches off the roof so that there was a lower probability of fire spreading into the tree off the roof. And you can see this tree is fairly large and quite probably would have impacted the neighbor. The fire would have probably spread easily through that crown to the neighbor. So ideally, if you have big specimen trees, they're really important to you. It doesn't mean necessarily cutting them down, but you can do quite a bit of work through our borer culture to remove some of the limbs, thin the tree, prune it up so that fire isn't easily going to spread up the tree and or engage the whole crown in the fire. And I mean, quite frankly, many of us buy the properties we have because we want that rural feeling of trees and that proximity to the forest. but there are things you can do to mitigate it. Here's another example. This tree was very, very dense, a real fuel hazard. This person didn't want to cut it down, wanted it for shade, etc. You can see they thinned it out and reduced the crown hazard. Still not ideal, but better than leaving it in the condition on the left. So there are some techniques that we can do to preserve some of these bigger trees and mitigate the risk to the homes. Here's some examples on Vancouver Island where they've done a nice job. They've still retained the odd Douglas fir, some arbutus, which are non-flammable, and they've got lots of defensible space on the property. On the right, you can see a real poor example of access. You've got the road here into the property is too narrow, and that property owner is going to be at risk if they have to evacuate or if the fire department has to come in there and get to the property to deal with a house fire. So that's very important. Here's some examples. This is a well. This garden here, all of it is deciduous. It's a good example of some quality landscaping. This home here, they chipped a large amount of material to mitigate the overstory hazard, but they created a surface hazard. This would all burn. This home on the right has these two black cisterns with a pump system with sprinklers that are all over the roof. Great concept, but what they did was they cleared the lot in the front here, and you can't see it, and it all came in as grass. Embers would alight this grass and go right underneath this decking and probably start this home on fire. Even though he's got proper siding, he's got proper roofing, he's got a sprinkler, this whole open deck situation with grass growing underneath it makes this house vulnerable to fire. And this was a case where somebody really understood 90% of the principles, but they missed the most important principle, which was conversion or removal of the trees on the front of this property, which is very rocky down to the road, all came into heavy to grass, and that grass cured during the summer and made this property very vulnerable to a rapidly spreading fire that would come underneath the home. Again, in that fuel zone, we want to remove that priority 2 zone. We want to remove the flammable vegetation. We can move the tree crowns up. The trees should be pruned as high as possible, minimum of 2 meters or 6 feet above the ground to prevent the fire from going up into the crowns. And we want to remove dead and down small woody material. And when I say small woody material, less than 6 inches. You can have bigger woody material. It's not as easily combustible. So that smaller material is what you really want to focus on, particularly in the immediate vicinity of the home. Here again, you can see propane next to a wood structure. These propane tanks would be vulnerable during a fire. You want to have them immediately away from the structure. The other thing you can't easily see here is that this home had a gap between the soil and the siding, and again, embers could spread into it. So not a good idea to have propane so close to your structure. Again, this is a subdivision design. You can see each of these homes with that priority zone 1 and 2. So that example I showed you up above here, this is a subdivision where all the homes were built with that defensible space concept. This is the layout of that subdivision. So they were relatively big rural lots, but every lot had a focus of protecting the individual home. There was access 2 ways from each of the properties, so you could go in either way. This was kind of a subgrade road that allowed access out, and this was the main road that went into the community. This is a community that was built in the Highlands, which is in the Victoria area. Another thing, if you've got wood burning stoves, you should screen your chimney, or you should not be burning during the fire season, because the embers can move out of your chimney and spread fire onto your roof or onto vulnerable vegetation on the property. This is that fine fuel that I talked about previously. You can see that all of this material is less than 6 inches or 12.5 centimeters. This is in an area that was close to a common trailway, and this is part of a property that we did some work on where we recommended doing a lot of cleanup of this to reduce. This material ignites easily, it dries quickly, and it spreads fire very rapidly. You do not want this in any area really close to your home, because this is where you would get a cigarette ignition when that material dries right out. So if someone threw a cigarette here, this is a prime ignition spot for that type of fire ignition. Again, some thinning. This is the stand before, this is the stand. So if you're interested in really removing a significant number of trees from your property, this is going from what would have been probably 70 to 80%, we call it crown closure, down to about 35% crown closure. So there's a significant reduction in the number of stems. You can see that the integration of fuel from the ground into the trees, the horizontal vertical integration of fuel, has been heavily modified to limit an ember shower would not easily spread here. It would be good for firefighters to get on the ground and attack a fire safely here. And you're not going to have a lot of high intensity fire that would be unsafe for firefighters. And that's just another subdivision layout. And the other consideration is evacuation. Have you got more than one route to get out of your home if fire is coming at you from two directions? If you don't, then as soon as you're notified, you need to leave. You shouldn't be staying around if you've only got one way in or one way out. And the fire service is going to alert you to do an evacuation. And I can't emphasize that staying to try and protect your home, particularly in our coastal ecosystems where there is a lot of fuel, the heat and potential fire behavior is such that I would never stick around trying to mitigate a fire. It's just not going to happen. It's difficult enough for our wildland people to try and attack some of these fires. Valuable for neighborhoods to work together to try and deal with this fuel. You can collectively get a chipping service or work with the municipality. There is funds available from the provincial government to sponsor local chipping of material a couple times a year. I know on Bowen Island, actually, to get this service, which they've been providing for the last 3 years through a grant from the province, you had to attend one of these workshops, sign up, and then you were eligible to have chipping come to your neighborhood and deal with some of your excess fuel. I know that Whistler has a Fire Smart program where you can sign up and they will come and assist you with materials. So more and more communities are adopting this approach to remove some of these high hazard fuels. And you can become certified as a Fire Smart community by undertaking some of these exercises. So if your municipal folks or the fire department are interested, I could provide some material on that. And that ends my presentation, and I guess I'll open the floor up to questions and or comments if anybody has any.
Thanks, Bruce. I'm just going to check quickly to make sure that I don't have any emails, questions that came in.
No problem.
No, I don't. And I don't see, is anybody interested in asking any questions through the chat function here? I'll just give everybody a moment to take a look at that if they're interested. And in the meantime, I also wanted to mention that we do have several of those links that Bruce mentioned in terms of Fire Smart messaging and materials on the village website. They're under our community safety tab, which has emergency preparedness and wildfire information on it. And I do see one question here. So can you see that, Bruce, or do you need me to click on that?
I'll go to the chat. I'll see if I can see it. No, I don't see it. Maybe you just ask me, Karen. It doesn't show me what you're seeing.
So I just got a question asking if deciduous trees are less flammable.
Yes, deciduous trees have a higher foliar moisture content, typically more significant, and they don't have as much leaf area. So they are less vulnerable to fire. So if you're talking about alder, you're talking about cottonwood, those trees are excellent, or even specimen trees that are deciduous are not going to be as flammable as any of the conifers that I'm talking about. If you want to talk about conifer flammability, Douglas fir, spots the most of any conifer. So it has a high spotting potential if it burns. Cedar is very flammable because of the extractives. And so cedar would be the next native tree that would be most concerned. And then hemlock, less so. Cedar and hemlock both are very sensitive to fire and are likely to be killed by fire, whereas Douglas fir has fire-resistant bark, and if it's a lower intensity surface fire, have a better chance of surviving.
Great, thanks for that. I don't see any more questions, so if anybody else wants to pop in, please feel free to do so. In the meantime, I'll just mention that you know, I'd like to thank Bruce for this presentation. There was lots of great information in the presentation, some very powerful messaging that I think is quite relevant to our community. And I really do hope that we can use this presentation, you know, as a springboard to encourage more personal preparedness within the community, you know, and to create a greater awareness and hopefully build on what we're doing here in Anmore in terms of protecting from wildfire. So I don't see any more comments here. Bruce, did you have anything else to add?
I was just going to say, Karen, if people have additional questions or things they want to ask, please encourage them to email me, and you have my email address. If I can help somebody, happy to do that.
That's great, thanks. I appreciate this, and also we will be getting the presentation up on the website shortly as well. So that's great. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for attending tonight. Appreciate your interest.
Great, thanks.
Good night.
Have a good night.
Thank you.